But oh yeah, that reminds me. Fucking what's the guy's name? The fucking, is it Kyle Rittenhouse? I was just thinking about this and like how like, because you know, people like that, but people like Kyle Rittenhouse and the fucking, who's the fucking like bowl cut guy, Dylan Roof, and all these fucking like all these lone wolves, all these like, you know, random acts, all these like random perpetrators of far right violence. We've all seen like the footage of cops where there's like they're exclusively policing like they're exclusively like policing like the Black Lives Matter protesters and just like letting fucking like rebel flag guys and like they're just like letting fucking like fascists and like fascist sympathizers and Proud Boys just kind of like do whatever. They let fucking like fucking what were the people protesting where they like just like stormed the state house with like fucking like AKs and shit? Yeah, so there's a reason like that type of violence is you know, condoned, and like peaceful like protests against like state violence are not condoned. But the way like the thing is like far right terrorists they're like the subcontractors of state violence. In a way, like the reason why these kids get away with like, you know, they like, for instance, the reason why like Kyle Rittenhouse got to just like go home is because the cops are really his coworkers. He kind of got hired by way of propaganda. And this like that whole like the propaganda that like leads to people seeing protests against state violence is like invading hordes and shit. That like propaganda that like that works people up into like a fucking hate crime frenzy is there so that the state can have people to enact a level of violence that cops can't necessarily get away with. It lets them, you know, have someone do that for them while the state gets to have plausible deniability. So people like Kyle Rittenhouse are an arm of the state. But, and this goes into like how Germany was affected by like fascism, and how every country's been affected by fascism. Even the people who are doing that violence are also victims of fascism. There's no coming back from like murder. He's a murderer now. And he's a victim of state violence. It's a more metaphysical sense of violence, but it is straight up violence. And you know, he was lied to and manipulated into fucking killing 2 people, almost 3. So it's very easy to get into the mindset of this kid's a fucking piece of shit. He's a subhuman scumbag. I would encourage people to reevaluate their like their perspective on this stuff, because like, you know, these people are also victims. Like Germany, when Germany lost World War II, like they were liberated from the Nazis. That's what happened. So I don't know. My point is, fucking all these like you know, terrorists are also victims. Like ICE, like, oh, that's my fuck. Look at that shit. Like ISIS, ISISers, they're also victims of Islamofascism. Fucking every guy who beats his wife is a victim of patriarchy. That's how this shit works. Yeah, my point was like, people like Kyle Rittenhouse and Dylan Roof and all the people who get basically conscripted by way of propaganda to do state violence. To do violence that the state would love to do, but they need to maintain a certain veneer of plausible deniability. what they do is they basically they brainwash people like Kyle Rittenhouse into doing that for them. And as a result, like this kid's life is fucked. Like ideology, remember, is a thing that is done to you. No one fucking just becomes a fucking like evil monstrous person. No one is like a fascist in their core, right? It's very easy to ascribe immutable characteristics to someone like that. So like this guy is just like, he's just like evil. He's just like he has a black soul. It's just a fucking like ball of soot, you know? But that's not how people work, right? Because like you're when you're born, you're a baby, right? And like you just like absorb the shit that gets like handed to you. If you just like break down, like at what point does someone like just become a fully a fully independent person? Like everything just like is purely like their own, like it's purely their choice, right? There's no like where do you cut it off? Like once they hit 15, suddenly it's just like everything's their fault, right? It's never purely one person's fault. It's always their material conditions. It's the ideology they've been raised with, the ideology that has been foisted upon them, you know? Like ideology is done to people. Like fascist ideology was done to Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Like he is a like fascist ideology is violence, and he is a victim of that ideology. It turned him into a murderer. That was done to him. He still committed murder, right? It's the same thing as like a soldier who like gets blown up in like the Middle East because they're doing colonialism and imperialism for the US. Like a soldier that gets blown up by an IED is also a victim of imperialism, even though they're out doing the imperialism. And like I understand like the anger, and I know it's like it's very scary and it hurts to see people go out and doing that, and it's very easy to like look at someone like him, look at the individual doing it and be like, this kid is evil. But it ignores the power structures at play. It ignores the ideology at play. It ignores the types of propaganda that are used, like the purpose that propaganda serves. That propaganda is there specifically to create actors that the state can have plausible deniability towards and be like, this person, he was there killing protesters, which we want to have happen, right? The state wants to kill protesters, people who protesting state violence. It wants to do that, but it can't just fucking like have people walking out in the official uniform and just like using live fire on protesters as much as they'd like to. So they have to subcontract that stuff. Like, I have like love for everyone. There's no fucking wiggle room. Like everyone is my brother. Fucking Benito Mussolini is my brother. Okay? There's no fucking wiggle room there. Okay? And what you have to understand is that there are structures of power that exist outside of people. It exists outside of like any human. It's fucking what's the dude who just like eats planets and shit? It's a machine. It's an automaton. All it does is turns rich. Capitalism is an automaton, and it turns rich people richer and poor people and working people into corpses. That's what it's there to do. It uses human bodies. Yeah, Galactus. Capitalism is Galactus. It's fucking, yeah. So it consumes human flesh. And the thing, like Kyle Rittenhouse and every fucking Timothy McVeigh and all those guys, right? They are part of the human, they're part of the human cost of capitalism. Okay, guys, okay. The foot soldiers of fascism are not benefiting from fascism. No fucking like individual stormtrooper like benefited like beyond just like, you know, maybe like the fucking like generals and shit like benefited materially from that. But the people like going out and just like fucking like shooting people, like what did they get out of it? They got like they got they got like a paycheck and like PTSD. Like that was it. Why were the Nazis able to take France? Because Nazi propaganda had already reached, it had already reached France. Like they had people waiting for them. They had extra state people who were doing far out violence outside of the explicit auspices of the state, because it helps for the state to maintain some sort of veneer of legitimacy. So they get to have the really severe violence subcontracted out to people who the state can just fucking wash their hands of. They don't have to. They can pretend like it's not their fault. They can pretend like it's not exactly what they wanted to have happen. And that's why you look at like the FBI just like letting the KKK run rampant, right? Because the KKK was there to enact state violence. Just because they're not wearing a uniform doesn't mean they're not doing state violence. Like, they're basically like the Uber drivers of fascism. It's there so that they can just fucking like, they can have like the really like awful grunt work just fucking like foisted onto them, and they can just like they can just not worry about the consequences of it because he's just a lone actor, quote unquote. And they can pretend like, oh, this guy's so bad, but it's like, this guy has been made an arm of the state, and he could have avoided that. I could have been a fucking like Nazi, dude. That whole meme about there being like a fork in the road if you're like a chanter. If you're like a chanter in the mid 2000s, there's a fork in the road, and you could either become like a white nationalist or a trans woman. And I picked the better fork, dude. But like, that's really only because like I had general like left liberal leanings already, and I caught videos like H Bomber Guy and stuff, of just like him making fun of Davis Arini. Who knows? Like if Kyle Rittenhouse had just like seen videos of like fucking H Bomber Guy making fun of the skull thing, like, he could have like still had the chance to be a normal kid, but he no longer has that. His life is like, fascism has ruined his life. That's not to take away that does not take away from the people he killed, okay? Like, they are both victims. The same way that a suicide bomber is also a victim, right? The idea that it's like a fucking only one person is allowed to be the victim. It's like, no. You have to understand that the capitalism is a machine, and it fucking kills people and ruins their lives. And fucking, even in the most like banal state, like it's they're like, they've been doing like studies on like the mental frameworks of like liberals and conservatives. Obviously it's like way reductive, right? Because like most people aren't going to actually be thinking about like what actual leftism is. But the framework that conservatives are operating on by and large is one of fear. It's one that sees the entire world as like this Wild West of like mobs that are coming to get you. And like you have to just like constantly be on guard and shit like that. You're constantly afraid. And even if you're just like, you get to just like live a quote unquote normal life and just like not have to deal with state violence at any point, that framework that has been instilled in you that you just have to live with now, that shortens your life. If you live constantly in fear, that like your life is just like material, like physically shittier. Your body's just made worse. And you can like, I maintain that you have to be willing to see everyone as your brother and everyone as your comrade in this, right? Because like, enacting like full on like luxury, whatever, like actual like bringing about like a socialist revolution and stuff like that will materially benefit people who like you would like politically speaking, there are your enemy, right? But like a socialist revolution would materially benefit people like Dylan Roof, and that's a good thing. Because Dylan Roof is a victim of racism. Racism made him into a killer. It did not have to be that way. But he got fucking like the stormtrooper thing and the new Star Wars movies. He was like taken as a child and turned into a foot soldier of the fascist state. You know, he could have been a normal fucking kid. He could have been like a fucking yellow rank rager in Tekken, right? But instead, he fucking shot up a fucking church.